In 1998, the economist Paul Krugman published a column that contained this sentence: by 2005, it will be clear that the internet's impact on the economy will have been no bigger than the fax machines. Krugman is a Nobel Prize winner. He had access to better data than almost anyone alive, and he was, on this question, almost spectacularly wrong. In 1977, the CEO of Digital Equipment Corporation, Ken Olsen, told a convention there was no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. In 1995, a research division at McKinsey forecast that the global market for mobile phones in 2000 would be about 900,000 units. The actual number turned out to be roughly 500 million. They were off by a factor of about 500. You are, statistically, watching this on one of those phones, or one of its descendants. 16 billion of them have been made. This video is about why smart people get the future so consistently wrong, and what to do about it. First, the unfair part. It is genuinely difficult to predict the future. People who try are doing something close to impossible. The fact that they get it wrong a lot is not, by itself, an indictment. But the patterns of how they get it wrong are not random. There are a small number of mistakes that brilliant people make over and over again. Once you know the mistakes, you start to see them everywhere, including sometimes in your own head. 5 of them. We're going to walk through each one. Each comes with a real, named example. Each comes with a way to catch yourself doing it. By the end of this video, you should have a quiet, slightly uncomfortable feeling that you've made at least one of these mistakes recently. That feeling is the point. Because the goal of this whole course is not to make you right about the future. It's to make you wrong more usefully. Wrong in smaller ways. Wrong in ways you notice fast. Wrong in ways you can update from. That is what a serious futurist actually does. They don't predict. They learn to be wrong on purpose, in controlled ways, so they get better at noticing the shape of how they're wrong. The goal isn't to be right. The goal is to be wrong usefully. Hold on to that. We're going to come back to it. Mistake 1. Linear thinking in an exponential world. A linear curve adds. Each step is the same size as the last one. Walk a mile, then walk another mile. An exponential curve multiplies. Each step is bigger than the last one. The classic example: fold a piece of paper in half 42 times, and if you somehow could, the folded paper would reach the moon. The first 30 folds get you somewhere on the order of a kilometer. The last 12 get you the rest of the way. Your brain isn't built to feel that. Almost no human brain is. This is what Paul Krugman missed in 1998. He looked at the internet the way most economists looked at most technologies, linearly. He saw the modem speeds. He saw the small number of users. He extrapolated forward at the rate things were currently growing. What he missed was the doubling. Look at this. The number of people on the internet roughly doubled every 2 to 3 years for 2 decades. 16 million in 1995. 361 million by 2000. A billion by 2005. If you had projected forward in 1998 the way Krugman did, linear, 2 or 3 more years of growth at current pace, the internet of 2005 would have looked like a slightly bigger version of the internet of 1998. Maybe 40 or 50 million users. Email, some shopping. If you had projected with doubling instead, you would have arrived approximately where reality went, a billion. Google as a verb, phones in pockets. The catch is that for most of an exponential curve, the linear guess and the exponential reality look very similar. They don't really diverge until the steep part of the curve, which is to say, you don't know, you got the math wrong until it's too late to revise the strategy. The rule of thumb is short. Ask, is the thing I'm forecasting roughly doubling on some regular schedule? Number of phones? Number of solar panels installed per year? Number of large language models trained over a certain size? Number of countries with internet access? If the thing doubles regularly, your linear instinct will mislead you. Almost always. Mistake 2. Recency bias. The tendency to weight the recent past way more heavily than the longer past when guessing the future. In 2008, after the financial crisis, Most forecasters expected another decade of crisis-level volatility. They expected serial recessions. They expected slow growth. Some of them were right about parts of it. Most of them missed that the recovery, however uneven, would last more than 10 years. Because what they were really doing was extrapolating from the last 18 months. The flip side is also recency bias. In 1999, after a decade of mostly peaceful economic growth and the collapse of the Soviet Union, public intellectuals talked about the end of history. Liberal democracy had won. Things were going to be calm now. September 2001 was less than 2 years away. The financial crisis was 8 years away. The COVID pandemic was 20 years away. The end of history was, in retrospect, the last few sentences of a really long book. The human brain weights what is recent and what is vivid. That's a useful feature for survival. If something almost killed you last week, you should probably remember that. The problem is the same feature makes long-range forecasting nearly impossible without correction. If you're doing serious thinking about the next 10 years, almost everything in your mental model is from the last 3. There's a small fix for this. If you grew up in a household where someone older than you talked about the world they knew when they were young, the war they lived through, the technology that didn't exist, the prices that were different by a factor of 10, your recency bias is naturally smaller. You can feel longer time on a personal level. If you didn't, you have to manufacture that feeling. Reading old newspapers helps. So does watching the long-form documentary your generation didn't make. The test for this one: would my forecast change if I had to base it on the last 20 years instead of the last 2? If the answer is yes, recency bias is doing the work. Mistake 3, normalcy bias. The brain's deep, deep insistence that whatever is happening now will keep happening, even when there is clear evidence it won't. Psychologists studied this in the aftermath of disasters. People in burning buildings would often continue their meetings. People in flooding stairwells would gather their belongings. The instinct toward normality is so strong that it can override survival instincts for the first 30 seconds of an emergency. Some people simply will not believe they need to leave. In late January 2020, public health officials in most countries had seen the data out of Wuhan. Some of them were genuinely worried. The general assumption, including by most governments, was, this will be contained. We've seen scares before. It will not really change anything. By March, almost every projection of how 2020 would go was obsolete. By April, the entire economic, political, and personal calendar of nearly every adult on Earth had been rewritten. The mistake wasn't in not predicting the pandemic. Lots of people had been warning about a pandemic for years. The mistake was the assumption, by smart people with good information, that this one would not be the one. Normalcy bias is sneaky because it doesn't feel like a bias. It feels like common sense. Things have been one way for years. The most reasonable prediction is that they'll keep being that way. And most of the time, you are right. The cost is that when you are wrong, you are catastrophically wrong. And you are wrong at exactly the moment when you most needed to be alert. A specific version of normalcy bias kills financial forecasting. The fancy name for it is the gambler's fallacy of stability. If something has been stable for a long time, the assumption is it will keep being stable. The truth is closer to the opposite. The longer something has been stable, the more pressure has been quietly building inside it. Earthquakes work that way. So do markets. So do empires. The test for normalcy bias: don't ask whether things will stay normal. Ask, what would have to change for the baseline to break? Then ask, can I name 3 of those changes already starting? If you can, normal probably won't hold. Mistake 4, the availability heuristic. This is the bias where you guess how common a thing is based on how easily you can remember an example of it. The easier it is to picture, the more common your brain assumes it is. The problem is, what is easy to picture isn't usually a good guide to what is common. What is easy to picture is what was on the news, and the news has a strong bias toward the rare and the dramatic. Shark attacks kill about 10 people a year worldwide. Heart disease kills about 18 million. Plane crashes get hours of news coverage and an air of dread. Car crashes kill more people in the United States every year than every plane crash in commercial aviation history combined. You know which one feels more dangerous. That feeling is the availability heuristic. For futures work, this is more dangerous than it sounds. The availability heuristic shapes which futures you treat as possible. If you're a futurist who reads a lot of news about AI, you will probably overweight AI as a driver of the next decade. If you're a futurist who reads a lot of news about geopolitics, you will probably overweight that. The system biggest on your newsfeed becomes the system you forecast most carefully about. The system not on your newsfeed disappears from your model, the version that costs the most. Most major futurist forecasts written in the 2000s spent a lot of time on artificial intelligence, climate change, and political polarization. They spent very little time on infectious disease. It was not that the data wasn't there. Pandemic risk had been near the top of every global risk register for decades. The data was perfectly available. The mental images were not. Nobody on a 2018 TED stage was running a scenario where the world economy paused in March 2020. That's the availability heuristic in operation. The test. If I had to forecast based only on data with no news in my memory, would I make the same forecast? Usually no. Usually the news has been doing about 30% of the thinking for you, and a fairly biased 30%. Mistake 5. Hindsight bias. The "I would have predicted that" trap. After something happens, the human brain reconstructs the past so it looks like the event was always going to happen. Of course the iPhone was going to take over. Of course Trump won. Of course the housing market crashed. Of course Russia invaded. The same brain before the event gave any of those scenarios maybe a 30% shot. In 2006, almost no major bank was forecasting a global financial crisis. After it happened, everyone remembered seeing the signs. After it happened, the signs were obvious. Before it happened, the same people who later claimed to have seen the signs were buying mortgage-backed securities by the billions. This isn't lying, mostly. It's the brain genuinely rewriting what was knowable. The damage hindsight bias does to futures work is enormous. If you don't notice yourself doing it, you start to believe that being right was easy and being wrong was negligent. So you start to believe you have a better track record than you do. So you stop checking yourself. Hindsight bias is the thing that makes brilliant people overconfident. Not arrogance, memory. The fix for hindsight bias is the discipline of writing your forecasts down with the confidence level attached. Module 7 has an entire video on this. For now, just notice the trap. When you find yourself saying, "I knew it," about a past event, ask yourself, did I write that down at the time? Almost always, no. The test. What did I actually believe a year ago about the thing I'm now claiming I saw coming? Be honest. If you can't reconstruct the actual belief, you don't get to claim the prediction. Look at the cone again, the cone of plausibility we keep coming back to. Each of those 5 biases does the same thing to the cone. Each of them squeezes the cone inward. Each of them takes the wide range of possible futures and narrows it down to a tight band that feels almost certain. That's what the biases really are. They're tools for collapsing the cone prematurely. They make a complicated, uncertain future feel like a clear, narrow one. They're not mistakes about facts. They're mistakes about uncertainty. That's worth repeating. All 5 biases are the same bias. They are all forms of the premature collapse of the cone. They take a wide future and pretend it's narrow. Smart people are especially prone to this, by the way. The smarter you are, the better you are at constructing a coherent story from the evidence in front of you. The better the story, the more it feels like the only possible story. The more it feels like the only story, the more you ignore the other futures still inside the cone. The smartest people are sometimes the worst forecasters, not because they're foolish, because they're too good at telling themselves the inside of their own narrow band. The fix is not to be less smart. The fix is to widen the cone on purpose, to make yourself imagine the futures that feel implausible, to deliberately consider the 3rd or 4th possibility, the one that doesn't fit the story you're already telling, to force yourself to spend at least some attention on the boring, slow signals, not just the dramatic recent ones. That's the discipline of foresight. Not getting smarter at predicting, getting better at keeping the cone wide. A useful test. After you make a forecast, before you commit to it, ask, what are the 3 most plausible alternative futures I just ignored? Write them down. You don't have to bet on them. Just acknowledge they're there. The best forecasters in studied populations, the so-called super forecasters, do exactly this. They don't predict more confidently than the rest of us. They predict less confidently. They hold more options open at once. They're more comfortable being a little uncertain about a lot of things than very certain about one. Time to come back to the case study. What do the 5 biases look like applied to the future of food? Linear bias, assuming current trends in global food trade continue in a straight line, ignoring that climate stress to agricultural yields is itself on a doubling curve in some regions. Recency bias, weighting the recent decade of relatively cheap food too heavily. The longer story, going back centuries, is much more volatile than recent generations have lived through. Normalcy bias, assuming the supermarket as we know it is permanent. It's about 70 years old. Most things that old are not permanent. Availability bias, forecasting based on what's on food news cycles, usually meat alternatives, organic this, gluten-free that, often missing the boring infrastructure questions like fertilizer prices that drive most of what actually happens. And hindsight bias. Most people who lived through the 1973 oil shock now claim they saw the price spikes in food coming. They didn't. The hardest part of foresight isn't seeing the future. It's catching yourself collapsing it. That's the work. Your microtask. Pick one prediction you made in the last year. Could be about your career, your relationship, the price of something, an election, a sports outcome, a friend's choice, the weather, anything. Pick one where you were wrong. Now ask which of the 5 biases was probably doing the work. Linear, recency, normalcy, availability, hindsight. Often it's more than one. Sometimes it's all of them. You don't have to journal about it. You don't have to do anything with the answer. Just notice. Naming the bias is most of the fix. This is the most useful video in the module, I think, because everything else in the course gets harder if you skip this. The other tools work only when you remember the tools are being held by someone whose brain is built to collapse the cone. The point of foresight is not certainty. The point is calibrated humility. You will be wrong. The question is whether you'll be wrong usefully. 3 takeaways. 1. Being smart is not protection against being wrong. The Nobel Prize winners get it wrong. The Harvard professors get it wrong. The McKinsey partners get it wrong. The brilliant strategists you read in serious magazines get it wrong. There's no level of intelligence that immunizes you from the 5 biases. Knowing they exist is the only fix. 2. The most useful skill isn't getting predictions right. It's getting wrong more usefully. Wrong in smaller ways, wrong faster, wrong in ways you can update from. 3. Calibration beats confidence. The forecaster who says, "I'm 60% sure," and turns out to be right about 60% of the time is doing better work than the forecaster who says, "I'm certain," and is right about 90% of the time. Always. We've reached the end of the conceptual half of Module 1. You now have the lens. You know the cone. You know systems are connected. You know time itself is a cultural choice. You know you have agency inside it. And you know how the brain trips itself when it tries to forecast. The last video of the module is the synthesis. We take one real decision, the kind a viewer might actually be sitting with, and we run it through everything we've built so far. It's the moment where the tools stop being separate and start being a single mental motion. See you there.